Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this online public policy dialogue at the EPC. We're going to be looking today at targeted ads. How can the DSA, DMA boost media pluralism and growth in the EU? My name is Andreas Aktoudianakis, and I lead the work on EU digital policy at the EPC. And I'm very happy to have today with us a panel of excellent speakers, experts, member of European Parliament and previous members of parliaments with us today. Mr. Paul Tang from the Socialists and Democrats in the European Parliament, Ms. Ruth Smeeth, Chief Executive Officer of the Index on Censorship and previous member of the House of Commons in the UK. We have with us also Mr. Ilias, Executive Director of the European Newspaper Publishers Association, and Mr. Daniel Knapp, who is Chief Economist at IAB Europe. We're also looking forward to Ms. Verna McGowan, who's Secretary General at the Center for Democracy and Technology, joining us soon. But there were unfortunately some connection issues that we are trying to resolve. So with this incredible panel of speakers today, I just would like to make a couple of points about some housekeeping rules so that our viewers have an idea about how the discussion will develop over the next hour and a half. So we're going to start with a short exchange between Mr. Paul Tang, MEP, and myself. And that will be for around 10 minutes or so. And after that, I will ask the other speakers to make their initial inputs on the topic, and of course, from their own background and expertise. After that, around 2:30 to 2:35, we are going to open the panel to a discussion among all speakers that will be moderated by me. And around 3:15, after 45 minutes, we will open the floor to questions and answers from our audience. And there are quite a few of you there today. So let me say, please already start thinking about your comments and questions you would like to share with us so that we can tackle them at the end, or even start addressing some of those during the main discussion. So without further ado, let me also welcome Ms. Verna Mccowen, who has now joined us. And without further ado, I would like to welcome Mr. Paul Tang to our panel today. Mr. Paul Tang, thank you so much for joining us. What a great opportunity to speak with you, and what incredible times we're living through. The work at the European Parliament must be really busy around these times. And I was wondering if you would like to give us your thoughts about where does the DSA move to, and whether the initial objective for enlarging media freedoms is still something that is going forward the way we were envisaging a year ago.
Well, if I had my say myself, that would be, of course, but it takes a whole parliament to adopt the legislation. But thank you for this opportunity to have this exchange. I'm really looking forward to it. It's good. It's not. I can't see the audience, of course, but I can see the co-panelists. But it's good to bring this discussion out of the back rooms and into the open. So that's what I appreciate about this exchange. And in the Parliament, there are heated debates on the use of personal data for advertising purposes. And that's just one of the debates that is ongoing. It's a debate, let me start with that one, that is not the first time in Parliament. We had initiative reports. I think it was roughly last year that these reports were adopted, where you saw that, but it's a bit of a complex process, even for the European Parliament, I must say. So I think we had then 3 reports adopted, where 2 of the 3 were very clear that we called for the Commission to limit tracking and targeting of consumers. But now the real thing is there, right? It's the legislation, and we have the discussion on targeted ads at 2 places, both the Digital Market Act and the Digital Service Act. Now, the discussions of these 2 files are pretty complicated because the files themselves are complicated, because also many committees are involved, so it takes a bit more time. So we're in the middle now of Econ and ITRE have adopted their positions, and we're now turning to one table, that's the IMCO table, and there is a postponement also to have the hearing with Francis Hogan. On the targeted ads, what you see, what we try to do is come up with a compromise that's both, let's say, the left wing and the right wing of the European Parliament would combine. My group, but also other groups, have argued for, let's say, limiting of tracking and targeted, ban on personalized ads, and ban on the use of personal data. That gets some traction with the more right-wing political groups, but they still think it's a choice of individuals to make. So there's in between. Now, what I try to explore, and which I think is an interesting avenue, is if you take this individual choice as a starting point, it's very unclear what your choice is if you choose for targeted ads. I think, confronted with a choice, we now have the experience from Apple a bit. I think a large number of users will not opt in, right? Or rather opt out. But even if you opt in, what do you opt in for? What is the product that you're choosing from? To what do you say yes? Because you don't know what data are being collected, when data are being collected, from which sources data are collected, what data are used. So I try to make clear also to the other political groups, well, if you want to restore consumer sovereignty, I use here a very much liberal term, we really need to define what a choice is. And that means also that you need to have you also need to limit or demarcate very clearly which data characteristics are being used and which data sources are being used. Because otherwise it's not a clear choice. If I say yes and then anything goes, hey, that's not a choice.
So maybe can I ask you,
just taking stock of where the discussion is now in Parliament, that's I think that's a sort of fair representation. I'm within that compromise, there are still restrictions on the use of some personal data that are highly sensitive, like ethnicity, political beliefs, membership of trade unions, which you don't want to go out there, which can be used, it can be the basis of forms of discrimination or bias that you don't want. So this is how we try to find a middle ground. But of course, my position would be still to be, I don't want to be tracked, I don't want to be targeted. I don't think it should be part of any business model by the gatekeepers. And I think the business model is preferred. Let's be clear on that. So I just described the compromise, my personal belief, and the belief of my political group goes far much farther than that.
Yeah, maybe just a question there, because you mentioned where other parties stand. And, we are aware about, the extremes in this dialogue, but we are not very much aware about what would be an informed middle ground that can address concerns both about privacy, but also about growth and media growth in that sense.
So this is what I try to outline a bit, and I hope you get the main idea of this compromise we're looking for. And that is of course a compromise, and I think that could be a way forward that could be very helpful. The question then also pops up: where does it need to? If you find a compromise, does it need to be in the DMA, or does it need in the DSA, or does it need to be in both? That's also a discussion currently at the Parliament, and I'm just happy to inform you to have this a bit more out in the open. But I do think that's very clear that that there is willingness to work towards this broader compromise, and that is needed also because we also know that the council is taking position. The council does what the council does. It mainly is bothered by the competences of the national authorities. No big changes, no big ideas in which they can find a coalition. So the council is sort of moving along the usual lines, meaning that in the end we will see a proposal from the European Parliament that will be very different than from the Council and the Commission. Now, let me add one thing, because I think that's important, because media diversity, it's one thing to say what you want to have limited. I think what is clear, what finds very broad support in the European Parliament is the idea of interoperability. And that is, in my mind, also very crucial for media diversity, because it allows better access, market access for other entities, companies to come into the market, and that is crucial for market diversity. The way I see it, for example, is of course one clear example of interoperability is the non-communication we have right now between WhatsApp and Signal. Fine, it's not my favorite example. I compare now the lack of diversity we have on social media. I can choose between Facebook, one timeline. I can go to Twitter, where I can have my Twitter timeline or chronological timeline, and I compare that to what I see in newspapers. I can choose out of a lot of newspapers which also offer timelines, and I know what a timeline I choose. I might choose a right-wing newspaper. I might do a more populist newspaper. I might choose a left-wing. But there are very different timelines you can choose from. We always valued diversity and independence of journalism.
Yeah,
that has been important, diversity. And this is what interoperability should also very much do within the DA, offering much more diversity, much more competition, and therefore much more variety to use.
Maybe just to make the link closer with fundamental freedoms and what the debate on targeted ads has to offer. There is the argument that with a complete ban on targeted advertising, that it could be disastrous for commercial interests, at least in the short term, right? But it could also be disastrous for media plurality in countries where diversity in media is very limited. So parts maybe of Europe where you hear, about a lack of not so independent media, right? So places that we refer to sometimes as illiberal democracies. Finding independent media is an issue in areas like this. And a concern here is that if there was a ban on targeted advertising, how could independent media publishers in so-called illiberal democracies, how can these independent media publishers still target access audience that they want to access independent journalism? So, I mean, I think that's an example that kind of,
Yeah.
I don't know. What do you think about that?
I don't. That's why I'm happy to have this exchange. I find this a somewhat odd argument. I understand, by the way, to be clear up front, that there is a question of transition, right? If you are, let's say, completely overtaken by a system which uses tracking and targeting, and you need to go to another system, there's an issue of transition, no doubt about it. So the short run, yes. On the long run, no. The current system, I would like to argue, is very much against media diversity, and the reason is pretty simple. We have the middleman, the intermediaries, taking up much of the money. There are digital advertising currently 2 companies, and Amazon is coming up a bit. There are currently 2 companies, Google and Facebook, that take most of the advertising revenue. It doesn't benefit that much publishers. It's at the cost of advertisers, and the middlemen take the money. And the simple story is cut out the middleman and everyone will be better off. It's as simple as that. We're not against advertising, by the way, let's that be clear. or against the use of the tracking and targeting, the use of the personal data on advertising. There are good examples out there of contextual advertising experimented in Norway, the Netherlands, by the New York Times, and experiments have proved to be very effective. So it doesn't mean the end of advertising.
Mm-hmm.
It means the end of personalized advertisement. That would be my aim, and I think there's a lot to gain from doing that, because currently the main beneficiaries are Google and Facebook, and this comes to the detriment of very much of the traditional media that we have built. We already know that being a journalist is a poor job in the sense that it earns you a poor wage, right? No, I think journalists are underpaid in our society. This hasn't become better over time, because money is diverted away from the traditional media in two ways. First of all, Google and Facebook are just bloody expensive. There are evidences, there is anecdotal evidence, and even more than that anecdotal evidence, that of every euro spent on advertising, more than 50% goes to Google and Facebook. They're bloody expensive, so to say.
Yeah.
And the second thing is the fact that personal data can be used. That means that you can be identified as a reader of the Financial Times, a reader of the Economist, a reader of Der Spiegel or Le Monde, without going to the website of the Financial Times, the Economist, Le Monde, or the Spiegel.
Yeah.
That is the problem. So the trademark of the traditional media is eroding because of personal advertising. So what we see is that the main beneficiary of digital advertising are Google and Facebook, and this comes to the detriment of our traditional media.
Yeah.
And this comes to the detriment, and we always thought for 2 centuries long that independent media independent, diverse media was the backbone of our democracy. We are eroding our democracies in this case.
Yeah, and I mean, this is where the Digital Services Act wants to make an impact, to bring these fundamental rights and freedoms in the online world to be as well protected as in the traditional sense. And maybe that's where we'll be interested to hear more about this middle point in the worlds between banning and not banning. Well, I would ask you to stop there unless you would like to say something else.
Let's go. Because I see the other co-panelists are, of course,
they're waiting for us. Of course. Oh, they are all making their points while we're speaking. So without any further delay, I'll just turn to Ms. Ruth Smeeth, who is a chief executive of the Index on Censorship and previously a member of the House of Commons in the UK. Ruth, the floor is yours. Please feel free to react.
Thank you. I think I could listen to Paul all day, actually. But I just want to slightly focus on some of the concerns that I am from Index on Censorship, but also another 21 organisations that have joined a coalition called Off On about some of the fundamental freedoms and the potential threat to them via the DSA, that I think from a media pluralism, but for those of us that care about freedom of expression, need just to be wary of. And it starts from the principle of the unintended consequences of this legislation. There has been a pattern for those people that aren't necessarily following it outside the European Union. In the UK, there's currently the online safety bill, which is progressing through the British Parliament, which has introduced a concept which the European Parliament are also now adopting called legal but harmful. And the concept for us, the idea that language could be censored, could be deleted, not because we as a society or our politicians in any legislature have decided that it is illegal, but because it could potentially be harmful based on a very vague definition, is of huge concern. And it also empowers the platforms that Paul was just talking about. They will become censors in chief because they'll get to decide what we can and can't see unless we get a very clear understanding of the transparency around the algorithms and AI that is deleting content. And in addition to that, and this is where the crossover for the DSA and the DMA, how much content is being deleted and who can see it. So one of the concerns I have in a British context is the fact that content is going to be deleted and there'll be no legal framework to store content in order to see, for 2 reasons. We won't be able to see what's been deleted. We won't be able to see language evolving that may or may not, but may have a trigger word in it that's been picked up by the AI, but that may or may not have the context or nuance that is historically associated with that language. And as someone who has, was in the public eye, who's been a target of abuse online that the DSA is trying to fix, I won't know if I'm vulnerable because content might be automatically deleted if it has certain keywords in it. So I'm Jewish, if it had the Y word in it, it's probably going to be automatically deleted. If it had threatened to kill me and I unfortunately had many death threats, I wouldn't know I was vulnerable. And that makes me very, very worried about how this will apply. So the legal but harmful element of this is a worry. There's also, in terms of some of the detail, the current ongoing debate about anonymity online and about protected accounts for journalists. And we publish and have done for 50 years a quarterly magazine which publishes the work of dissidents, both starting from Eastern Europe, but now in Eastern Europe and beyond. The idea of not being able to access anonymous accounts will very much limit our communication, and that is doubled down on when you consider the impact on end-to-end encryption. The impact on our sources, the impact on our private conversations is very, very clear. I used Twitter on Tuesday to engage with one of my to check up on one of my sources in Hong Kong. It is the safest platform for them to use at the moment. That and Signal is the only way I can engage with them. That's where they feel safest. The idea that we will ban anonymous accounts means that, where did we get our evidence on what's happened in Syria, on Myanmar? I mean, we've got to be very, very careful about the unintended consequences. And the other part of this, and I say this to any politicians listening, it isn't just my dissidents that I would worry about. If I am a victim of domestic violence, I am potentially going to set up an anonymous account in order to access services. If I am a young person exploring my sexuality, but I live in a traditional small c conservative environment, I am going to set up an anonymous account as I find myself. We've got to be very, very careful that we are not over censoring and the unintended consequences of potentially politicians trying to do the right thing. The other element of this is the content moderation that and how we're going to do that. I've had conversations, and it's in a wider context. We've got mums groups that meet online in the UK. Mumsnet is an active website, but we have communities that exist online. These are not entities with huge resources that could develop the AI to do content moderation on their sites, yet they could get caught. We also, and this is a huge concern of mine and does touch on what Paul talked about, and as did you, Andreas, but the state-based arbitration for me is a big concern. I think Oban's definition of what legal but harmful could look like would be very different to Mccowen's and very, very different to mine, and yet could have an impact across the whole European Union. And if I have an issue about access to abortion information and Poland, I mean, we've got to be very, very careful about language, and this would have the complete opposite effect of what we want to achieve in a democratic society. The other thing, and finally, this is probably when I'm going to be most controversial, but it's the journalistic exemptions that are also going to be applied. A two-tier internet that we have never collectively as a society been able to agree what is or is not a journalist. And there are many bad faith actors who would call themselves citizen journalists. There are also good faith actors who would call themselves citizen journalists. There is, in the UK, there is someone who is of very extreme politics who seeks protection under the definition of journalist. He's never been a journalist. And I think, unless you're going to have very clear definitions on what we're actually protecting, then this could potentially make the situation even worse. And what you would be doing is protecting hate speech rather than challenging abusive speech. So I think we've got to be very careful about what we're trying to achieve. And the challenge to Paul with 1,000 pages of amendments is huge, but this is mammoth, and we need to figure out how we actually come through to protect the fundamental freedoms that the European Union was founded on.
Thank you, Ruth, for bringing this perspective. It's fascinating to hear about how things that we see from one side can look exactly the opposite from the other side, and this perspective actually manages to show that. Thanks very much for this. I think there's a few things to unpack there that I have noted down, but at this point, I'd just like to turn to Mr. Ilias Konteas, who, being director of the European Newspaper Publishers Association, will may be able to offer us the perspective from the publishers and the reactions to in this debate. Ilias, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andreas, and thank you for inviting me today with my two hats, representing newspaper publishers and magazine publishers at the same time. And of course, I've listened very carefully and with great interest to interventions by Mr. Tang and by Mrs. Smeeth, and I think they touched on both angles of the debate right now, looking on the issue of targeted advertising, but also on the issue of, let's say, content control within the DSA. And I would like maybe to offer some initial remarks when we are talking about the impact or the potential impact on fundamental freedoms and media pluralism before moving to the topic of the ban or the restrictions on targeted advertising, whatever form they may take. So from the point of view of limiting media freedoms and whatever form content controls may take, I would say that as a principal point, we don't see there should be or there is no space for illegal content online. Because the press in any European country will have to comply with national and European rules on content and on illegal content. So when we are talking about imposing restrictions on legal content, and we spoke about the terms and conditions of the very large online platforms as we see it being discussed in the DSA, already we see the risks there in the sense that definitions of harmful, fake, reliable can be easily manipulated and biased. And you also talk about, let's say, the so-called illiberal democracies and to what extent they can play an impact there on this debate. From our point of view, and I think Europe can pride itself on the fact that historically the press has been an indispensable tool for its democracy. So limiting legal content for us poses certain risks, depriving the public opinion of critical information. And this is where we have not just us, but a broader coalition introduced the element and the proposals on the non-interference clause, which basically would say that very large online platforms cannot limit legal content on the basis of their terms and conditions. So basically, they should not be the only censors of the internet deciding what we should read and under which conditions we should read it. This we can discuss a bit later on, I imagine, but already I would like to say that we do not feel that here we need to have a blanket protection clause. And I know that there are concerns that have been raised and some points that have been made, but I see two safeguards here necessary. Basically, we have already the general platform liability for media content in the DSA that would say that illegal media content should be removed and should continue to be removed, and such a non-interference principle should apply to domestic and EU providers only. And now, maybe a few preliminary comments on the issue of the ban on targeted advertising that we started discussing. Of course, I think it's no surprise, and I think we have come out publicly on this, that we are concerned about these proposals. We have taken a stance both vis-a-vis the discussions at the European Parliament, in the several committees, and in the Council. We feel that there is a misconception here that a switch to contextual, to opt-ins, to other options would be supported by publishers, by the media. This is not the case. What we are worried is that the prohibition, whatever form this takes, or the restriction, would basically jeopardize the sustainability of the media. And again, I want to stress the point that you made on those countries, or on those illiberal democracies, where independent media might have to compete with media that receive state subsidies. Another element at this stage that I would like to stress is the competition angle. We feel that the ban would not restore the level playing field, but on the contrary, it would still distort the gatekeeping power of the big platforms that control the data and control the online advertising. A last point. We are concerned, a last point, at least at this stage of the discussion, we are concerned that if we are talking about restrictions, if we are talking about monetary payments, about opt-ins, or any form of a compromise here, basically, again, there are going to be large segments that will be cut off of the access to information. And I don't think this is something that we want to see happening. And this probably brings us back to what was being mentioned earlier on the so-called unintended consequences. But I will stop here, and thank you again for the invitation. And of course, happy to keep on discussing this.
Very well. Thanks very much, Ilias, for this. Very insightful, and great to have also the perspective of the business and association you represent. That's great, thank you. I will now turn to Ms. Verna Mccowen, Secretary General of the Center for Democracy and Technology. Verna, thank you very much for joining us, and it would be fascinating to hear your perspective and how you react to the first issue, how DSA pushes media freedoms, and perhaps also the link on targeted ads. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Andreas, and thank you to the EPC for hosting and for inviting us. For those of you who are not aware, the Center for Democracy and Technology is a not-for-profit NGO running here from Brussels, and we look at protecting human rights and democracy in the digital age. So obviously, these very questions are at the heart of our work on the Digital Services Act and today. So maybe I'll just start with a broader point about democracy and media freedoms in the DSA and some of the protections that we need, and then talk specifically about this matter of targeted advertising, which is of deep concern, I know, to a lot of those in the not-for-profit sector. So firstly, I think it'll be really essential, we're talking about the Digital Services Act as a once-in-generation opportunity. People are talking about it like the constitution of the internet. And really it's no exaggeration to say that our democracy, free expression, media is really on the line in these conversations. And it's also really important to say that this is a huge piece of very complicated legislation. We need to be very thoughtful about the role of the platforms and their accountability, but also about the role of governments and government accountability, which is our more traditional concern sometimes in media freedoms, as well as then how the different actors participate online. Some of the concerns at the Center for Democracy and Technology that we have, although there's a lot to be welcome about the mandatory transparency that the DSA is introducing, more procedural rights for users, but I would concur with some of the other speakers to say that we are very worried that because of the way things like intermediary liability are being tampered with, that ironically, this is going to, if it goes, some of the provisions go through as they're currently being proposed, it will make online platforms judge, jury, and executioner about what is legal content online. And obviously in a democracy, that's deeply problematic. And from an international human rights law perspective, we would say that the judiciary in our societies are the ones that we say have to be the final arbiter of what is legal or not. So we just be very careful that sometimes, obviously recognizing that we do have a lot of issues with online content, but ironically, making online platforms the judge of the legality of that content throws up a lot of issues for journalists, for human rights defenders, as well as in our society as a whole. So that's really one of the core questions when it comes to that. Moving on a little bit more to the question of today, the very question of targeted advertising, I think we need to be very careful with being clear about what we're talking about. So I refer to, for example, there's different ways that you can do targeting that is not necessarily in violation of human rights and fundamental freedoms. Unfortunately, that's not the situation in the ecosystem that we see at the moment that's happening. I really appreciated the work of the European Data Protection Supervisor when he quite concisely said what we need to do is that we need to phase out pervasive tracking. And I think that language is really important because it gets us to the core of the issue. Why is it a problem in a democracy that people can be, targeted? We saw with Cambridge Analytica how very sensitive user data was used to dissuade entire sections of community, including members of the Black community, from voting in the United States. It's a very serious consequence on an election. So we need to remind ourselves as a society why it's never a good idea to track and retain certain information. I think in Europe, we also, we're talking about the Digital Services Act. Let us not forget that we have one of the most advanced privacy legislations in the world, GDPR. GDPR already, we've agreed as a society to say that you cannot track, especially the sensitive data, health data, membership of a trade union, member of a political party. That's already prohibited unless you have explicit consent. And yet that is happening on a large scale across lots of different online spaces. You can give an example of whereby you might innocently search for one project that's linked to your health data, and yet a few weeks later, you're constantly seeing or being targeted for other ads. That should not be happening. So, we definitely have to talk about how the DSA can bring that conversation forward, but we also need to be honest about the extent of enforcement of our existing privacy legislation and laws, whereby this kind of pervasive tracking is still happening. We need to look at alternatives as well, such as alternatives that actually put more focus on the user choice. What do I want to see online? What's my option? Context-based advertising that is not based on this deep well of personal and pervasive information on individuals, which is really important. And another important point, I think, about at the Centre for Democracy and Technology, we work a lot on election integrity. There is a big problem with micro-targeting in the context of elections. So we talk about media pluralism, but if you are micro-targeted so much that you're, that based on maybe your fears or your presumptions or different profiling information, in the end, you're not going to see the whole scope of media pluralism. What you're going to see is what's being fed to you by a particular opaque algorithm. And that might actually mean that you have people in the same jurisdiction of an election who have entirely different information. That's even more problematic when it comes to things like where do you vote, or actually, quality information about the voting processes itself. So we also need to remember that from a media pluralism perspective, we need to imagine our online environments differently to make sure that we actually have an area or ensure that there's quality, informative journalistic information getting across to all users, rather than this area that creates silos and echo chambers and, indeed sometimes disinformation. And we know, and that's something to appeal to any lawmakers, please don't go after the individual pieces of content, go after the system. The system is, we know that pervasive use of tracking of data drives disinformation and causes some of these problems online. So please don't go after the individuals of content. Let's question the system and let's look at alternatives to keep a vibrant space online to protect our democracies.
Thank you very much, Verna. Thank you. Great to have this point, and very, very useful for the discussion that will ensue. Thank you. And I will turn now to Mr. Daniel Knapp, who's a chief economist at EAB in Europe. I know that Mr. Knapp has recently composed a very interesting research around some of the key themes of the topic discussion, and happy for you, Daniel, to parse takeaways and other points that you think are relevant from your research.
Thank you very much for having me, and this has already indeed been a very stimulating debate. Let me just clarify my role. I do work for and with the IAB as a chief economist, but I'm an independent economist. I also work for other clients and also work with academic institutions. And Paul, when I look at the report that you and your colleague issued, I'm also in intellectual exchange with a lot of the interviewees that have provided insights for your report. And one of my particular interests outside of IAB is data science work to unravel the complexities and intransparencies of the programmatic advertising supply chain. So I look at this whole ecosystem, mainly from an economic point of view, but both from a macro and a micro perspective. But I'm a sociologist by training, and one of my favorite books is by Carolyn Marvin called "When Old Technologies Were New." And there's a wonderful quote in there where, when a new technology was being launched, a big magazine bemoaned, "We shall soon be nothing but transparent heaps of jelly to one another." This quote could have been posed yesterday, but it comes from 1893. From American Electrician, the Wired magazine of the day, which I think illustrates very well that we have had a tense relationship between technology on the one hand and contemporary perceptions of privacy on the other for quite some time. And I think it's very important to abstract here for a little bit and see that we are not really in this unique time today as if we just have a momentary focus, we believe there is. And I think we can very much, without reverting to bans on targeting, have a very constructive, also critical approach towards industry practices and so forth, but trying to reconcile what technology can do for publishers, for consumers, and also the very important goods of privacy protection, anti-discrimination, and so forth on the other. And this very much, I think, requires, first of all, that we frame the issue properly. And I very much welcome that everybody here has used terms targeting, tracking, personalization interchangeably, because how we frame this topic often already predetermines outcomes. So I very much appreciate that we are, as a group here, seem to be very open towards this. There are multiple angles to address this topic of targeted or addressable advertising. And before I come to media pluralism, let me start with a few other angles which are focused on in my report, which are published with IAB Europe. The first, I think, very important benefit of targeted advertising is for small and medium-sized businesses, which are increasingly being digitized as they're coming out of the pandemic, and they're finding themselves in a new world where they don't just do digital advertising in a brick and mortar economy, but they're doing advertising, customer acquisition, retention in an economy that is now digital by default. And these are businesses which are mom and pop shops, are 5 to 10 employees and so forth, 21 million of those in Europe with 84 million employees as by the latest European Commission statistics. They do require digital advertising to thrive. And we saw this during the pandemic, where it was a live experiment where we could observe whether advertising and targeting in particular is something discretionary that they could cut down on or something else. And indeed, despite economic uncertainty, SMEs across the globe, also in Europe, they maintained or increased the level of investment in targeted advertising because it allowed them to acquire and retain customers under times of economic uncertainty with very manageable and controllable costs. So that's the advertiser perspective. We sometimes hear reports that targeted advertising doesn't work, but that often comes from big brand advertisers who have very different objectives. We need to see that with any approach that we take, because citizens are also employees, that we ensure that our European competitiveness, that the strength of our SMEs, which the EC itself calls the backbone of the European economy, is being supported. These are not just any SMEs, but they're often SMEs of specific cultural significance. Think of small businesses in the travel industry, of goods of protected origin, and so forth. Also, in Europe, we are now seeing us emerging more competitively against the US and China when it comes to startups, scale-ups, unicorns, and so forth, who also see targeted advertising as so vital that they're not outsourcing this to an advertising agency anymore, but bringing these roles in-house, meaning they are hiring people to do this continuously because it's crucial, integrally important for the success of their business. Then there is the publisher and the consumer perspective. Let me start with the publisher perspective. Indeed, if you look at a range of studies, there seems to be contradictory evidence about the effectiveness of targeted advertising. But that is often because there are other small-scale studies or studies funded with a particular interest in mind. So there's hardly anything really true, broad-scale, independent out there. I work myself in a different capacity with publishers to help unravel the programmatic supply chain. And we find that contextual advertising is important, but it can't be a fix-all. It can only be one component of a broader array of approaches. Luckily, we're at a stage now in the industry where the entire foundation on how targeting is being done, how data is being used, and also how consent will be obtained is changing. The pivotal moment where third-party cookies are phasing out, where Apple, through some design choices, actually implemented a kind of coder's law practice by defining what is targeting, what is addressable, and so forth. So I think it's very important that with any approaches that we take, we are not removing the ability of the industry to innovate, proposing different solutions, because we all agree that what has happened in the past, it wasn't perfect. Privacy standards have evolved, the industry grew kind of haphazardly, bottom up, and we're now at a stage where we can recreate these foundations. But if we a priori restrict or limit something, we have a huge strain on innovation in Europe. In particular, when it comes to publishers, contextual works for some, yes, but for others it doesn't. A key asset that many publishers have is their first-party data, the information about their audience, logged in users, and so forth. And this data in this post-third-party cookie world is becoming a massive competitive advantage. Publishers also, in this new world, have the opportunity to specify consent, value exchange, and so forth. Let us enable them to do that and use that data that they have in a clearly demarcated way to actually grow competitiveness. I also believe that many of the issues that publishers are currently seeing about targeting are not because targeting doesn't work. It is an issue that several of you also illustrated. It's an issue of the supply chain. For advertisers, it undoubtedly works. No one is questioning that. But people are questioning whether it works for publishers. But that's less because targeting is effective or not effective. It is about where does the money flow. And as an industry, we have seen a lot of opacity in the programmatic supply chain. And I believe instead of looking at a ban for targeted advertising, if we shed transparency on the supply chain, understand who is taking money, and ensuring that money is being maximized for the publisher, we can solve a lot of the economic issues from a publisher perspective. And lastly, from a consumer perspective, if publishers have first-party data, it will be, as I said, easier to obtain consent. We need to, of course, balance exactly what data is being used for. But I believe this isn't specific to advertising. And this isn't something that a ban on targeting could solve. But this is a broader discussion where I think the ad industry just serves as a bellwether for bigger issues in every aspect of economy and society, which is turning kind of more algorithmically enabled. Right? It's the credit scoring industry, it's banking, it will be in the future the automotive industry and so forth, where we have to understand what is the best relationship between addressability and the use of data and the protection of consumers. And I think I would invite regulators and industry to work together constructively to resolve this and see the ad industry as a laboratory where I think broader stakes can be defined that could be applied to other industrial sectors and the rest of the economy and society.
Well, thanks very much, Daniel. Super interesting. And super useful to discuss about the different incentives with which different sectors engage this debate. We have been discussing here about a few things that everybody agrees are very important, but I think in terms of prioritizing these, that's maybe where some of our disagreements about what would an ideal approach should look like. So we have been discussing about the COVID-19 pandemic and how had this put digital at the center of society and economic activity. In this post-COVID-19 environment, we want companies in the EU to grow and innovate. And this is also in line with previous policymakers' calls about strategic autonomy and digital sovereignty. And there's also so much money that's poured into digital at the moment. So at the same time, though, we are discussing about consumer choice and how to enlarge that. And also we are discussing about something that sometimes looks contradictory to consumer choice, and that is individual freedoms and the right to privacy. So how can you be both a happy consumer with a lot of choice at your disposal and at the same time a citizen that feels that their privacy rights are protected to the uttermost? I'm not saying that I have an answer to this question. I just tried to map some of the priorities that are quite conflicting, but also extremely important, all of them. I'd just like now to open up the panel to discuss among us in a conversational way. And I would just like maybe to come back to Mr. Paul Tang, who we started this debate with at the start. Mr. Paul Tang, there were a few views that were explored. I wonder if you would like to react to any of those, and yeah, if how would you like to react to what we heard from all speakers?
Well, I very much appreciate this debate, and I'm a bit struggling to find out where to respond to, because there are different angles you can take are being taken. But let me briefly touch upon the distinction between harmful and illegal content that was brought forward by Ruth and Verna. And I think overall, but I really have to look at the text, how they are in the DSA. Overall, the Parliament is very suspicious of making that distinction, right? So that's so I don't expect, but it's indeed crucial to have this to not go into the debate of what is harmful or not. But let me focus my main attention for now on the position by Ilias and Daniel, because I think that's one of the issues I really need to address here. And it's interesting to see also the difference between the two. So Ilias representing the publishers, Daniel representing not sure what, but let's say research. Sorry, Daniel, for that, but saying that okay, the advertisers may benefit, said Daniel, but publishers do not. That was an argument. So that's an interesting point there for discussion here. And hearing the words of Ilias, one expression comes to mind, and that is called Stockholm syndrome. Sorry for that, but you've become so dependent on these two companies. You can't see life without it. That is the issue what's in there. Again, I repeat my point, and was not really dived into by Daniel, I'm afraid. The Google and Facebook are very expensive intermediaries. They suck the money out of the system, because if Verna is right, we need to discuss the system here. They suck the money out of the system, and that is much to the benefit of Google and Facebook, but not, of course, for the publishers. So in that sense, you want to have that, if only for that, you want to have a change in the system. You can do much better than this. But it doesn't really address, because that's also a point of competition policy. It doesn't address the issue of data. I say for data, what I find surprising, there's not much research out there that indeed shows that personalized ads are so much more effective than contextual ads. What we have seen contextual ads that have been pretty effective also for the smaller publishers, the SMEs, you could say. So that I find very interesting, that of course, Google and Facebook will always claim it's effective. It's their core business. You're going to sell the product. You're going to say it's a wonderful product. But is it really that effective? I'm not so sure about that. What you also see is that there's a constant element of surprise. Customers getting used to the advertisement, so you need to come up with new ways to keep, because the whole game, this is the attention of the economics of attention. Trying to get attention, trying to keep attention. That's what is this whole business model is all about. And to get the attention, you need to surprise. And that's why we don't know what with the data occurs. So it's not just about the tracking, which invades our privacy. It's also very much to do with the algorithms that use this data to surprise us, just to keep our attention. That is currently how the system is working. And that has led, of course, to the dissemination of fake news, conspiracy theories, and all that. It's very clear that the commercial parties companies don't have an interest to stop that, because it's in their commercial interest. One final point, sorry, Andreas, you could get me out. I could go on for hours. I would love to do this. Maybe we should have schedule a next meeting already. That's the position of SMEs. If the intermediaries are so expensive, how come the SMEs are the winner of this game? I very much distrust this argument. I can't believe it's true. I think there are other ways to advertise. We have lived without targeted ads for many years, and the SMEs survived perfectly. And now all of a sudden they have grown dependent on the technology from two oligopolists, Google and Facebook.
Yeah.
My intuition goes completely the other way, I must say.
Thank you, Mr. Tang. I think we all agree on how the business models of many companies out there were designed for 15 years ago. And now some of the ills that come with these business models are explored, and business regulations, obviously, everybody wants them to succeed in that. But getting the balance right, I think, is something that still no one is entirely clear about, and the stakes are high. Maybe I'm not expressing an opinion here. I'd just like to turn to Mr. Konteas if he would like to respond to Mr. Tang.
Well, I mean, not maybe respond directly, but maybe commenting. I mean, I have been characterized of many things, maybe not necessarily Stockholm syndrome vis-a-vis Google and Facebook, but it's a good one for sure. I mean, for me, the things are quite simple and straightforward. And I think the research of Mr. Knapp and others has basically demonstrated that, and you said it, Andreas, yourself at the beginning, in a post-COVID world where the sector has been hit severely by numerous restrictions and a decline on print in many countries, and not just the big ones, not the big media, but mostly the smaller ones. In smaller regions where they were not able to disseminate disseminate their printed editions. For us, it is clear and it is very straightforward that it is an essential source of revenue. It is valuable for advertisers, as I understood, and of course, it offers a better user experience online. Now, I would like to make maybe 3 points here. When we are talking about data protection and privacy, as far as I understand, at least, the current situation, there is no legal gap when it comes on data protection standards. We have the GDPR, we have the privacy directive, the e-privacy regulation being negotiated. What I see is that enforcement basically here is an issue, but it must tackle the gatekeepers because they have more access to data, clearly, to first-party data compared to us, compared to the smaller publishers, and of course they have the resources to avoid scrutiny. A second point, I haven't heard how a ban would restore the level playing field, a ban or a restriction or any compromise, and what form it would take, would restore the level playing field with the gatekeepers, with the Googles, with the Facebooks. because they would still be able to provide more targeted ads, even in a contextual context. And what would happen, I would see, is that advertisers would concentrate investment on the big platforms, not on the publishers. And maybe a third point, for me, it is important as well, is the risk for democracy. And I think this is a serious risk and a threat that we can see a hit on many publications, smaller publications across Europe, because they would have fewer tools available to resist and to go against competition by state-subsidized publications. And this would affect the independence of news media. Again, what I would like to say basically is that, of course, I think we all have a similar starting point. We may not have the same understanding and the same conclusions of the situation, but when it comes to our perspective, we have to keep in mind that these models finance independent European media providing quality journalism, and I think this is something that we all want here. And I will pause here to leave to others the possibility to react as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ilias. Yeah, super interesting. Maybe if I should turn to our other panelists who haven't responded or we haven't heard from lately, Ruth or Iverna. Would you like to react perhaps to what is being discussed, maybe in more detail with regards to what a ban would entail? Because it seems here that we are sure that a change needs to happen, but we understand that there are short-term fears, consequences that a ban would have a disastrous effect for the phasing or for the transition. What approach could there be that can, both satisfy the need for transparency, but also to give the ecosystem the time it needs to adjust and not to suddenly move the carpet under their feet? If anybody would like to comment on that. Iverna, yes, please.
Yeah, I mean, like I said at the beginning, I think we have to be very careful about what language that we're using here. And I think it's good that there is some consensus to say, look, if we took a number of steps, if GDPR was really enforced fully, that would already reduce the pervasiveness of tracking and address some of the issues from a human rights and democracy perspective. Furthermore, I believe that, if we acknowledge that particularly pervasive tracking, micro-targeting is actually damaging towards a media plural environment, I think that's a really important point as well. So we have to accept that pervasive tracking is problematic overall and say, how do we actually, how do we imagine a transition to a context-based model where we're not, having such mass amounts of data? And then I would say also, when we think about the Digital Services Act in the broader sense, we need to think of other ways to actually protect journalistic integrity. Another issue that's come up is this point about legally mandated trusted flaggers. We've talked already about countries where the rule of law is under pressure. Can you imagine the government being allowed to pick who gets to say what language or stays up or down when you have a journalist that's investigating corruption or a news organization that's challenging the government? So I think we also need to, beyond this very important issue of moving away from pervasive tracking, imagining what contextual advertising will look like that can still therefore deliver some of the objectives that their other colleagues are talking about. But then at the same time, look more broadly at the other provisions in the DSA that have other implications on the work of investigative journalists and others, and be very mindful and thoughtful about those provisions as well.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Verna. I think it's also very important to be clear on what kind of obligations we expect many of these services to abide by, because as many of you have touched upon this, you wouldn't like any private company to have the role of a judge or on deciding how to enforce fundamental freedoms online. So there is, interestingly, in Article 12, paragraph 2 of the DSA, there is mention about the due diligence of service providers to protect freedoms and to act in proportionate and diligent matters. How can we expect service providers to, like, is there, I mean, and this is a question addressed to all of you, and I think Ruth would like already to, so I'll come straight to you, Ruth. How can we expect service providers to do something like that successfully? Do they have the competencies they need? Ruth, please.
So I think some of this is just absurd, in my opinion, because you look at this, it's very easy to view this through the prism of the really, really big platforms where pressure can be put on, political pressure, governance, regulatory pressure to say this is actually what we want to achieve. But we're not just talking about the big platforms, we're talking about every platform and about a regulatory framework that needs to be fair and consistent, that doesn't stop barriers to entry, that allows every access so that there is a level playing field. This isn't going to work in that context because what you're requiring is huge, what would be required is huge. So we've got to be very clear about, my real concern with any regulation online is starting from the place about we all act as though about how we engage online, and actually how we engage online, we're a bit odd. All of us are a bit odd probably in about how we engage online compared to a 18-year-old, to a 12-year-old, to someone, to different parts of the European Union. So there isn't a standard way of engagement. There's not standard platforms for engagement because we all use the online platform differently. So how you're going to ensure a level playing field exists in this area is really, really difficult. And I'm very nervous about how you outsource some of this, especially in a free speech context, to the platforms for them to make their minds up. And there's two examples of that. Already, something is twice as likely to be deleted if it's in Urdu or Arabic than if it's in English. Now, that will not be about content, that will be about someone who wrote the algorithm and their inbuilt bias about deletion. And we have to be really, really apprehensive about that. And so, I just think we need to be very careful about what we're asking them to do without transparency and without us being able to actually see what they're doing. And I say it very candidly, there are very clever people on this call, but I don't understand coding. I wouldn't be able to look at the code to see whether that whether the level of transparency was there. We are going to need our own experts to be able to do that.
Thank you very much, Ruth. This is very useful. Absolutely, and the choice seems to be a choice about ethics. What we're discussing here, because at once you want to empower some groups, but while empowering some groups, you might disempowering others. Whether these are journalists, dissident journalists, or other investigative journalists. There is currently in the DSA in Article 31 provision for transparency and data access for civil society organizations and investigative journalists. And I remember back in the days, the civil society that I used to work with, we were extremely happy about this success. Do you feel that enough has been done in that regard to empower those groups? A broader question, but also if you would like to comment on the point we're just raising, and I see Verna, please, has raised her hand. Go ahead, Verna.
Yeah, if I may, just on the due diligence point, because this is something that the Centre for Democracy and Technology is looking at very closely. So again, to remind ourselves, we already have internationally agreed guidelines in United Nations guidelines on business and human rights. And I think it's a real opportunity to actually bring those same logic into the Digital Services Act. My concern at the way the due diligence, in particular Article 26, is phrased at the moment, is that it's actually putting on companies, it's like due diligence for how obediently you respond to government ordered removals. So are you being diligent when the government tells you to remove a piece of content? And actually, under international human rights law, what we should be framing that language is to say, companies must have due diligence for the human rights impact of their own products and services. So that would actually focus it more on, you know, is it a problem because of a pervasive use of data and algorithm that we're having a discriminatory impact? Have we actually amplified disproportionately this amount that's causing other harms? And again, it steers us away from this really problematic approach of individual decisions on legality of content, and makes us look at what are the real responsibilities of the very large online platforms. To be clear, 26 is that article is on the very large online platforms. So I think that's a really important point to get right. And I would appeal again to all lawmakers to think about that and to use some existing research and standards that we have in that area. I think that's a really important point.
Super. Yeah, you were about to say something else, or
sorry, you had asked a second point and I've forgotten already.
Maybe I forgot it too. I will turn to Daniel because I saw he had raised his hand. Daniel, yes. Please.
I saw the debate racing on, and I just wanted to pause a little bit, and I feel really obliged to come back to what Paul said. Firstly, about the SMEs, that you're not buying the point. I think, Paul, it's very important to understand that, yes, SMEs have been around for a long time. Number one, we've got many more of them. And secondly, their business is now online, right? They were acquiring, think of the Greek tourism business, a tour guide. They were acquiring customers at the port, whatever. Now they're acquiring customers online, and the goods and services that they're providing are also online. Plus, if you're not buying the point, we don't even need an academic study on this. I mean, the entire SME segment itself is a large-scale experiment which gives the evidence. If it wouldn't work for them, the margins are so tight, they wouldn't do it. Coming back to a second point about the duopoly, Google, Facebook, or triopoly, Amazon. Of course, market concentration is a huge issue in digital advertising. But would a ban on targeting really solve that? I don't think so. I think it's more about the supply chain and ensuring that publishers can make more money from programmatic advertising. One thing that I found in my work is that there is a knowledge gap, in particular a data science and analysis knowledge gap. Those publishers who can optimize what is a very complex world that programmatic advertising set up, who really use the data that this programmatic system provides them with to their advantage, they can actually increase revenue significantly and also ensure that they get a higher share of the overall budget, building direct relationships with advertisers and so forth. So I think when we talk about the ban on target advertising, I think it misses the point, because it often it seems to be a very simple fix to a very complex set of issues that all conflate together. And I think it's in one sense, it's an avoidance of the really complex factors and unraveling them and trying to fix those through just this ban on targeted advertising. One other thing also is that publishers have always been under pressure, even before the duopoly emerged. We also now have people's attention competing elsewhere. Think of Uber, for instance. Uber is about to launch ads. Uber might buy an ad tech company. Yesterday, I was at a conference in Amsterdam where you see the largest retailers in Europe. Think of an Albert Heijn supermarket. Think of a perfume shop like Douglas in Germany. Think of Boots Pharmacy in the UK. They have first-party data on their customers, and they're using that to build advertising businesses. Maybe that compete with publishers, but in data sharing alliances like we have in Germany, it's also complementary. But fundamentally, these are European companies that are growing based on targeted advertising. Their ad revenues by 100, 200% year on year. And they're also collaborating, building coalitions with publishers to really provide a Europe Inc. approach, if you will, to create more scale and more competition in digital advertising. And I think these are points very, very important to consider. My very last point is, when we speak about platforms, it's very easy if we fall into the Cambridge Analytica stories and so forth, which, by the way, if you look at the final report, and the FT did a good piece on this, was revealed as a hoax because it didn't work. But the fundamental thing here is the optimization logic of content algorithms, which is a very important thing in democracy. That has nothing to do with targeted advertising. What, for instance, a Facebook does in optimizing its news feeds, advertising data doesn't feed into there. It's the advertiser's data that comes in completely separate from Facebook. And on that basis, then targeted ads are being shown. But these things, there's the optimization logic and the data feeds that go into content on the one hand and advertising on the other, they are separate. And this is often being mixed up. And I think we shouldn't fall in this populistic trap but really analyze these things very succinctly.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I am becoming aware of time, and I'd just like to nod to our listeners to already start thinking about their questions, because I'm going to open the panel to Q&A in a couple of minutes. Coming back to Daniel, your last point, I think as you mentioned, Europe Inc. Somewhere there. I would like maybe to take a step back and give the word back to Mr. Paul Tang. Thinking about where Europe is at the moment, we, as other speakers have mentioned earlier, GDPR was a gold standard that became established, and in many ways nobody had a similar response to data protection at the time that Europe gave its own response. Now the DSA, DMA, I think, was it Iverna or somebody else who said that these regulations will largely constitute the constitution of the internet in the years to come. I think, it's not possible to overstate any of this, because it's very true. But it's also true that at this point, Europe has been thinking very much about how to explain the meaning of EU strategic autonomy and digital sovereignty. What do these concepts mean nowadays, when we are no longer in geopolitics with President Trump in the White House? It seems there is a lot of movement about getting the platform economy regulated, not only in the EU, but crucially in the US too, because then you can have this network effect where EU and US can regulate together responsibly about content and about markets. And then you can have perhaps a way to export the Europe Inc. point of Daniel back there, how to export the standards about regulation online. So my question would be, how does this debate link to that? How can we ensure that the EU remains competitive and that EU strategic autonomy means growth, but also European values, not only discussing about privacy without the care for how the economics of how businesses work. So maybe I'll just stop there before I blabble any further, and just ask Mr. Tang if you would like to reflect to any of this, and if not,
yeah. Let me try to have a step at this. First is the transatlantic relation. It's going to be interesting, right? We see several issues emerge, for example, on emission trading and the carbon border adjustment, where you don't see that Europe and America aligns. This also may be very well true for legislation for the Digital Market Act and Digital Service Act. We don't know at this stage yet. When I'm in contact with my counterparts in Washington, I can see we share the same concerns, right? So in that sense, but doesn't mean you share a common response. And for me, it's still unclear what US response will be to the problems that we face. It could very well be, for a European answer is to put forward legislation. That's what we do in Europe. That's why we are the front runner in legislation. But in the US, it could very well be that they will try to tie the screws on competition policy. We have the nomination of Lina Khan and the Federal Trade Commission, which is a harbinger of more stringent competition policy, because this is what it in the end is. If you look at, that brings me to my second point, if you look at, let's say, the success of the US in digital technology, their success is very simple. It's building monopoly power. It's market power, very traditional. So that's the way they can, it's not just, they like to tell they are very innovative, they like to tell that they connect the world, but at the same time, they are able to collect the money. They put themselves in a position. So what we see is that they are dominating social media, cloud services, and so on. So that is what and the European way, in my mind, would be to make sure that we have the diversity and that we also have competition. And this is what part of his, this is where the discussion of media plurality and strategic autonomy comes together. You would try to dismantle the American market power, and at the same time build a system where there is equal access for all. And that I think would also be very European, because making money doesn't mean you do good for society, right? So let's sort of break that. So I think that part of the big tech, they've brought wonderful things to my life, no doubt about that. But in fact, they could have done much better. So that's one way to see it. And for me, to my mind, I would very much like to see if there's innovation on the European side. Yeah, but in our interest of the users and of our society. Because I think there is still a lot to be gained. In that sense, the use of data is a new technology that opens up many possibilities that we haven't really explored yet, but is not put to good use automatically, especially when it's dominated by commercial enshrined interests.
Thank you, Mr. Tang. Thank you very much for this.
Daniel, maybe if I could offer a couple of thoughts, I may slightly go off topic, but since we mentioned DMA and DSA and digital sovereignty of Europe, I think indeed we are in a break it or make it moment, because indeed I would say the whole world is looking at what is happening. We are having in front of us two fundamental pieces of legislation. And when we are talking about access, about fair access, about non-discriminatory access, about obliging the platforms, the monopolies to offer this kind of access, we are still not there in the DMA, for instance, even though the parliament might be moving at a better pace on this than the council right now. And on the DSA, I think what is equally important is what was also mentioned by Iverna earlier, that I think from a democratic perspective, from a press freedom perspective, from a media pluralism perspective, it is dangerous to say that we allow those platforms that we try to regulate on the DMA to define on the basis of their terms and conditions what content can we access, can we read, can we see. On the last point, I think what Daniel was saying about Europe Inc., I think probably he highlighted or he outlined better than I did what kind of role advertising has been playing with some specific company examples. But I would like to say that the sustainability of a sector coming out of the COVID pandemic is impacted by what we may or may not decide here.
Very well, thank you, Ilias. We are now in the Q&A session officially. I have not received the questions that we have not tackled on, but please let me know if you would like to take the floor, and I will offer you the chance to voice your question. In the meantime, I'd just like to come back to the main topic of our discussion today. So in a way to wrap up our discussion and also take some useful takeaways. I would just like to to address this question to the panel, and please feel free to make your statement, and maybe this would be also your parting words. What would an ideal regime for targeted ads look like to you? Because it seems that most of you, if not all, but maybe not most of you, agree that a blanket ban would be problematic, especially in the short term. What would be an ideal way that would address both concerns about data privacy and about media growth and pluralism currently in the EU? What would an approach like that look like? And I invite you to raise your hand if you would like me to give you the word first. Daniel, and then Iverna.
Happy to start. I think there are many moving parts to this. First, what we need in Europe is collaboration and scale among publishers to provide a more attractive offer to advertisers, reach, technology, and so forth. Targeted advertising for that is important. But I think we can in Europe resolve that targeting and privacy protection are not mutually exclusive. So I would say, instead of looking at a ban, support and nurture the work that's already going on in terms of data clean rooms, consent around first-party data, and so forth, to enable industry, with regards to consumer rights as well, of course, figure out new ways on how this apparent conflict can be resolved. The other thing is, targeted advertising always needs to have a transparent supply chain. So it's not just about the use of data, but it's also about understanding who's in the middle, having clear KYC procedures and so forth, which also addresses the issue of misinformation. So to summarize, collaboration between media owners, publishers, support privacy compliant or privacy first approaches of matching, merging data for targeting, opt-ins, clear ones, driven by publishers and value exchange, and lastly, look at the supply chain of targeting.
Thank you, Daniel. I'll just turn now to Iverna. Iverna?
Thank you. I think there's a number of different principles that we can look for. One is we really need to explore the potential of context-based advertising. I think it's been underexplored and would solve a lot of the challenges. We need people to be truly empowered to understand the extent of how their data is being used and to have meaningful consent, because GDPR is meaningless unless people really have the power themselves to understand when and how that data is being used, and also to withdraw consent in the cases that might be happening. We also need to think about things indeed like data minimization. There's a whole question about what amount of data being stored or abused. And I do link that to things like, I just wanted to mention, I'm sure perhaps that wasn't really meant, but in the Cambridge Analytica scandal, I mean, we know that Black voters were targeted and dissuaded to vote, etc. That can happen at scale in any of our democracies if we're not very careful about minimizing the type of information that's stored, and also data minimization more generally. So there are some key principles I would see to try and preserve democracy and human rights in the digital age.
Thank you very much, Verna. Might I turn to our other speakers if they would like to make a parting statement before we close? Mr. Tang, please. And then Mr. Smeeth. Miss Smeeth, yeah.
Sorry, I pushed the wrong button. Well, I don't think that personal data should be used for advertising. Simple as that. I don't think it had much value. I think it leads to danger that we heard about, and up to the perverse, right? That it leads to an economy not only where our privacy is invaded, but also to forms of discrimination or the dissemination of fake news. So what I would like to see, though, is very much, it doesn't mean that I'm against advertising. I think contextual advertising is very effective, also effective for SMEs. If you look for shoes in your search screen, probably that's the best moment to advertise shoes, and probably in your neighborhood. You could allow that as consumer. But my point is also that what I very much aim with this legislation, because we say we want informed consent, but I find the business models as they're out there so opaque. You can't see, as a user or consumer or whatever you call it, you can't see what the consequences of your decision are. And I want to have a very clear relation between the provider of the services and the user. And that's the current advertising ecosystem are so opaque that it doesn't live up to this simple standard, that there's a clear relation, a sort of clear transaction, if you like, between the provider of your services and the user of that services. That's what we should aim for.
Thank you very much, Paul. That's very clear. Ruth?
I just actually, as final comments, I think one of the things that, as I touched on right at the beginning, that I am most concerned about in terms of the DSA and the DMA are the unintended consequences. And if you view that through the prism of targeted advertising, actually how we've ended up is current regulation and the unintended consequences that we now see, whether it's what election material you get to see in an election cycle, or whether it's how you're being targeted as straw. It's the unintended consequences, which are very, very hard to legislate for, but if anything should make members of the European Parliament quite concerned about, in the round, what they're actually signing up for in the DSA as a whole.
Maybe.
Thank you, Ruth. And Ilias, some party comments.
Just two words, and with the risk of sounding repetitive, I would say that what we have been discussing here so far, for me, from my perspective, remains an essential source of a sector that has been severely hit. I see the room for coexistence. I'm not sure it's the right word, but symmetry with the privacy issues and the consumer concerns and consumer protection. On contextual ads, maybe one word, I'm not sure it can always work or be suitable for general interest news. What can we advertise next to an article that talks about an armed conflict somewhere? But okay, maybe that's a topic for another discussion or another panel. But for me, what is also equally important here is to make sure that we have, we do not undermine in countries where we have problems and issues, an independent and sustainable press from being able to voice opinions and formulate and be part of the public debate. And I think this is something that is very important from our perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ilias, for finishing on putting on the spotlight independent publishers and accessing their audiences. That's extremely important, right? And I think I got you right there. But there's also many other points that you made that are super important there. And anyway, I'd just like to thank you all for participating in this debate. It is a very heated debate at the moment, and I'm very happy that we all made very useful, meaningful, and balanced inputs that are actually useful in understanding what different stakeholders see as the priority here. Just like to thank you all again and thank all our viewers for tuning in. And you said it, there are so many other issues that we need to discuss following this exchange. So I think you will be hearing from me soon. Thank you again and have a great day ahead.